Welcome to Budapest. This is the sixth episode of my podcast on the crisis of liberal democracies. I'm Ivan Scalfarotto, and today I have with me Thomas Carothers, who's a researcher dedicated to understanding the condition of democracy globally and also how some countries try to support democracy beyond the borders. He's based at Carnegie Endowment International Peace, an independent think tank headquartered in Washington, D.C., with offices in several other regions, including Europe, Middle East, and Asia. And now, let's get started. Thomas Carothers. Tom, thank you very much for joining me at Budapest. And the question for you is the same I've asked the other guests before you. What is your Budapest? Where do you see the line between democracies and autocracies fall?
Well, thank you very much. Great to be here with you. I'm spending several months in Budapest for family reasons, and I have, over the past 20 years, actually spent quite a bit of time here. So it's a country that's fairly familiar to me. As I'm sure your listeners know, over the last 15, 16 years, Hungary has become the least democratic country in the European Union. It's done through a whole series of measures that have been well documented by many organizations and analysts. I wouldn't go through them here. But the result is a country today that's really on the edge. It's on the edge of how much further does it go? And for the first time, really since Viktor Orban returned to power in 2010, for the first time he's facing a challenger who presents a real threat to his continued rule. That's a person who sort of came by surprise onto the Hungarian political landscape 2 years ago because he was part of the Fidesz establishment, but then he broke from it. He's a lawyer, and he broke from it 2 years ago after some complicated events involving his ex-wife, who was the Minister of Justice, and he emerged as a challenger to Fidesz, and he created a party, TISA. And since then, he has been working hard to organize the party, to build its base of support. And we find ourselves today, just a month out from the national elections that will be held on April 12th, with a situation where the government is really feeling its back to the wall politically. Public opinion polls, credible polls, show that TISA is polling, at least among motivated voters or likely to vote voters, around 52, 53%, whereas the government party, Fidesz, more like 38, 39%. It's a very significant change from the way things have been in previous years. So the big question, Ivan, is will this government allow this election to really go ahead? It's already an unlevel playing field in all kinds of ways, especially the domination of the media by the government, the use of state resources by the government on behalf of its party aspirations. But will it allow this election to take place without really any more significant interference? And if it does come out behind, will it, step away from power and cede power to the opposition? In a way, this is not just a defining moment for Hungary, it's a defining moment for the European Union. The European Union has never had, within its membership, it has had on its borders in Belarus, in Georgia, in Serbia, countries where elections have been stolen, like in Belarus and Georgia, the results essentially overturned. But it's never had such a country within the European Union. And if Hungary were to do that, the European Union would face, I wouldn't call it an existential crisis, but it would face a real deep challenge about how much is democracy really a defining value of the European Union.
So it could be a very important moment, like a sort of a dividing moment where there's a before and an after. But I'd like to ask you something on the other big liberal democracy globally, which is the United States, because I think, and I agree with you, that some political transitions, they have a precise moment that mark a point of no return. And this could be the one for Hungary and the European Union. But we've seen flag lowered, we've seen walls fallen. Now, do you think that the re-election of a president in the United States, a president that challenged openly the principle of the orderly and peaceful transfer of power, has constituted such a moment for American democracy?
No, I don't think it has. It's certainly a very, very important development. I mean, when Donald Trump contributed to the insurrection against the vote counting or the electoral process in early 2021, and then the Republican Party kind of, after a bit of hesitation, re-embraced him. That was a defining moment for the Republican Party. It was a moment at which the party made clear that it was putting its vision for the country, its desire to transform the country in ways that it wants to, ahead of a commitment to democratic values. And that was a moment in the polarization of American politics in which you said, well, here's one side that has really faced a key democratic turning point here and embraced the idea that, I'm sorry, we just want to keep pursuing our vision, and if we're just not going to pay that much attention to this fundamental democratic challenge that Donald Trump contributed to. So that was a defining moment for the Republican Party. And then, of course, the re-election of Trump was a sign that those Americans who voted for him were willing to go along with that. We're willing to say, we have a vision for this country, and we happen to believe it's better for the country, despite what anyone may say or believe or think about whether or not we're a democratic force. And so we're on that path now. We have in power a president who's trying to build the power of the executive in a whole series of ways. And he's trying to impose that expanded executive on all kinds of parts of the society where it hasn't before, from universities to law firms to civic organizations and many others. And he's doing so consistent with a real contempt for democratic norms, I would say. So we're in a process, but I don't agree that just that election itself was a Berlin Wall moment in reverse or really a single moment. We're in a process in the United States, an ongoing process and a contested one.
But choosing someone who basically tried openly to find votes that were not there, like find me some 11,000 votes to the Georgia state, wasn't that a precise choice of the electorate? Weren't they saying, well, elections are not that important, or at least I'm okay with someone running the country who doesn't recognize the principles of democracy, of a liberal democracy? Isn't it like saying, well, elections are not that important if someone can, deliberately try to change the outcome? Wasn't that a way to...
That's, Ivan, how you interpret
Okay.
their vote. But that's not how they would interpret it. If you ask them, they would not say that. They would say that U.S. democracy is under threat in a variety of ways that upset us and unsettle us here on the conservative side of the spectrum. And we believe that we can save American democracy by voting for this person. Yeah, okay, he's not perfect. He's a bit of a loose cannon, as we say in English, a bull in a china shop. But we have a larger fidelity here to the American vision, which we're voting for. Now, I don't happen to agree with what they want to do with American democracy in many ways, but many Trump voters believe they were voting to protect American democracy, not to undercut it. And I think we have to take seriously the mindset of the other side. I'm going to come back to this later on in the show. I'm not justifying them or excusing them, but I think putting our interpretation on what they thought or what they would have said would be a mistake.
I see. And do you think that this new interpretation of the executive power, is it going to stay, or do you think that with the new president in 3 years' time, 2.5, we can go back to normality? Is this going to leave a scar? Or do you think, is it going to set a precedent and the executive powers will be going forward interpreted in a more extensive way? How do you see things going on in the future after this very visible and innovative presidency?
Well, I'd separate two things here. First, the expanded power of the president is a longer term process in the United States. It's been going on for a couple of decades. Both Democratic and Republican presidents have expanded the power of the presidency. There's a whole series of reasons for that. Part of it's the personalization of politics in many countries. We see it even in the UK. When Tony Blair emerged, he was a more presidential kind of prime minister. Even I'd say in Italy, Meloni is in some ways she tries to act as a more presidential prime minister than some prime ministers used to in Italy. So we've seen a concentration of power around individuals in a lot of democracies. So what Trump is doing is he's on steroids. He's taking it much further. But I don't expect that when he eventually leaves power, the U.S. presidency is going to shrink back down in size very much. But the second part is what he's doing in terms of overriding democratic norms. That's something different. Attacking political opponents using, the tools of the legal system. That's different than simply expanding the power of the presidency. Trying to intimidate the free press and to curtail opinions in the press that he doesn't like. That's something different than just expanding. It's an exercise of presidential power, but you could expand the presidential power without being anti-democratic in these kind of ways. Now, I'm hoping very much that those things go back in the box or disappear after Trump, and there's no guarantee of that. But I think we should separate out the general question of the structure of American democracy versus these particular anti-democratic practices by this president.
But do you think that we have a say in Italian that you cannot put the toothpaste back when it's out, of the tube? Do you think it would be possible for future presidents to avoid the temptation to use those powers in the same way? I mean, of course, you expand the powers and giving it up, going back is in a way giving up power that your predecessor has conquered in a way.
Yeah.
Are we relying on the goodwill of his successors, or do you think it will be the system itself to force it back once a personality less, let's say, less large than Trump's will be at the White House?
Well, I don't think we're trying to just rely on the potential goodwill of his successors. I think we're trying to rely on the system and say that when Donald Trump tried to do these things, he was checked, limited by a legal system that said, hey, wait a minute, there are limitations on what you can do here in terms of, say, attacking the free press or undercutting the independence of prosecutors and so forth. And as well a broader societal pushback saying, you're going to pay a political price for this. This is more than what citizens want. This is not central to your agenda. And it's more that if he faces real limitations, both in terms of boundaries around his power legally and other ways, and also pays a price electorally, then his successors will think, it's not really worth it. Whatever their intentions are, whatever their love of power will be, they will say, this wasn't productive for him. That's the key thing. If he pays a price electorally and shows that, the country shows that this is not a winning strategy over the medium to long term, that will be the way that democracy is safeguarded.
And do you think that we are in this process? So do you see Trump's popularity declining at this moment? So do you feel that the system is already reacting or not?
Yes, it is. Yeah, and I think, I read a number of conservative newspapers and a number of newspapers or magazines or expert commentary on social media, and many people are warning him that you've taken a good thing too far in their view. I don't happen to agree that he's even taken a good thing in many cases, but they would say, no, you're going too far. His popularity opinion polls show has clearly declined, not an enormous amount, but a significant amount, enough to make a big difference in the midterm elections that will be coming up in November this year. Mm-hmm. And I think there is some limitation going on. I know many Europeans, Ivan, look at the United States and say, we don't see as much protest as we'd like to see. How come there aren't millions of people out on the streets saying, stop, stop, stop? They imagine, like in Paris, huge protests that the French people are very good at. The United States tends not to do such protests. There have been protests. The No Kings protest was significant. It was several million people in different parts of the country. But the pushback that Donald Trump is experiencing is it's more decentralized. It comes from universities working against his efforts to control them, some law firms pushing back against what he's done, some civic organizations, pushing for this. The free press has not been curtailed and it's pushed back in various ways. The courts in many cases have. It's on many different fronts. And so the United States is a pretty big, complicated political system with a lot of parts. And Donald Trump is trying to be the master of the whole domain, but there are limits even to that.
Okay, thank you. Question. In 2002, you argued that most countries living authoritarianism, they don't transition straight to democracy, but they rather get stuck in a gray zone, which is neither dictatorial nor clearly democratic. Can you explain that concept to us, and does it still hold as a framework today?
In the 1990s, we had a happy assumption that many of the countries, or even most of the countries that had managed to pull down authoritarian leaders through protests in the late 80s or early 90s, were going to kind of then move very naturally and relatively quickly to democracy. And we saw democracy as a kind of natural state of being. Humans want freedom. They want to have a voice. They don't want the government to tell them what to think or to do. And that once you get rid of the obstacle, then people will just embrace freedom and democracy will occur. But what we began to realize in the late 90s and early 2000s in many of these countries that no, democracy is actually really difficult. It's very hard to build a culture of tolerance for opposition in which many citizens accept and say, no, there can be people who just have a completely different view, and I have to accept that. And I have to assume they're going to have time and power, just as we're going to have time and power. It's hard for power holders to accept the courts. Really, you can't just call the judge on the phone and say, "Don't do that." It's actually creating limitations on power turns out to be very hard. Sure, freedom's attractive and you want to embrace it, but limiting power, constraining power, is actually very difficult. And so a lot of countries began kind of like cars, where the driver's asleep at the wheel and they start to drift, and you're like, watch out, you're going to crash. Countries began moving in a lot of different directions. And I won't go through them all, but I sort of described this gray zone as I saw many different countries that were not re-embracing autocracy in the old-fashioned way, but were sort of partly there, halfway there, and in different ways. And I described it as a gray zone, a pretty vague concept, but one that I think many people living in such countries felt was a better description than just saying, oh, here you are in this country in transition to democracy. They'd say, well, if I'm in transition to democracy, why does each election get worse rather than better? Or why are there so many political parties fading in and out of power and don't seem to know what they're doing? Why is it that independent institutions are in a very vague state of control and so forth? And so these ambiguities and this back and forth nature was a better description of where many of these countries that embraced democracy in theory in the late 80s or early 90s have ended up.
Yeah. And you've also written about the autocratic playbook, which is the set of tools that backsliding leaders use across very different countries. We spoke about Orban, who is perhaps the clearest European example. Now, the question I have for you is, how did that playbook spread? Was there active coordination between autocrats? And this could be possibly the theory that Anne Applebaum speaks about in her book Autocracies, Inc., where she sees, links between the various autocrats in the world? Or do you think that was simply imitation?
The autocratic playbook it's not rocket science. If you're a leader and you think, I'd like to just kind of stay in power as long as I can. I don't want to give up power. And what do I need to do that? It's not really a mystery. You need to identify every independent source of power that might constrain you and undercut it. So you look out and you see courts and think, well, yeah, I need to retire a bunch of judges and pass a new judicial law that gives me power over appointing judges. You see the legislature trying to oppose you on certain things, so you undercut them in different ways. You see civic organizations protesting, so you declare them to be foreign conspirators. You see cultural organizations putting on theater productions that make fun of you, and so you appoint new directors of theaters and so forth. So the autocratic playbook is just like a list of independent institutions, and you just tick them off one by one and find ways to undercut them all. So I think any autocrat, or budding autocrat who wants to consolidate power, tends to gravitate towards some version of the same playbook. Now, so not hard to just sort of figure out on your own, and people have been doing it for generations, actually. But in the last 10 or 15 years, as Anne Applebaum, a tremendous analyst of democracy worldwide, and others have pointed out, there is a lot of, watching each other, learning from each other, admiring each other among leaders doing this, particularly in certain areas. I would say, for example, that attacking the civic sector is something that President Putin did in Russia in the mid-2000s. He started doing that. Russian NGO law in 2005 was very influential. A lot of governments are like, yeah, I haven't really paid a lot of attention to that civic sector before, but you're telling me it's very dangerous. I better take a look. I see what you do. You pass this NGO law saying you can't accept foreign funding because that makes you into, an agent of George Soros or something. And so the civic sector, there was a lot of learning there. Or another area where there was a lot of learning was kind of narratives, like President Putin and other leaders, Viktor Orban and others, began putting forward narratives of what they were doing, saying, no, this isn't anti-democratic. This is an alternative way of thinking about politics. This is anti-globalism, anti-elitism. And they began spinning a narrative that, worked for them in various ways. And so other leaders were like, hey, I want to be part of that narrative. I could do that too. So it was a combination of the autocratic playbook, which has its own logic, and leaders find on their own, but then they do watch, imitate, learn from each other.
How do you interpret that part of this toolbox is often legislation against the LGBTQ plus community? Because this has happened in Russia, of course, in Hungary. We're seeing the same thing happening in Georgia immediately after the anti-foreign agent legislation. They approved an anti-gay propaganda, so-called piece of legislation. How do you interpret that?
Well, I think for many of these autocrats, their core base of support is often in the rural parts of the country. It's often the older people in the country, people who have not really moved with social change. And they know that this is an area which is, particularly questionable or even unpopular among their core bases of support. And so rather than attacking all human rights equally and saying, I'm against human rights, instead they say, it's gone too far. You sort of try to get at the frontier issue in human rights, which is extending rights to these communities that are traditionally discriminated against, and say that's the problem. Is these people are, they should be put back where they were before. So you do that to appeal to your core, and you try to work the edges of freedom back. You start at the edge and then try to work back to the center. So I think it's not surprising, because these were issues on which a lot of change had occurred in a short time. Not everyone was ready for that change, and so it made it vulnerable to counterattack.
Yeah, interesting. And also probably identifying an enemy is something that brings people together, and LGBT people are not necessarily popular. I mean, even President Trump, I think just a few days ago, signed a bill to exclude transgendered athletes from competitions. And
yeah, transgender has been a rallying point for U.S. conservatives now for some time. That's the edge of the edge. They're not attacking, say, gay marriage, but then they're going out and saying, well, okay, but it's really transgender. It's like there's the edge and then the edge of the edge in their view, and so they're focusing very much on that. And they feel that there's not very strong public support for that, so that's become a real rallying point for them.
Yeah, and I was also surprised. I mean, surprised. I was impressed when the Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill, after the invasion of Ukraine, said that Ukraine was leaning towards the Western corruption, and part of that was, of course, the LGBT set of rights. But also, again, it seems to be, we're different. These are the decadent model of liberal democracies, where our illiberal democracies, as Orban defined it, is like stronger, more capable of making decisions, and stands to the values that we represent.
Yeah, I think that's all true.
Yeah, and a question for you. Now, of course, we discussed about at the beginning about Orban and Hungary, but we know that far right parties are on the rise, even in Western Europe. I think of France, I think of Germany, of course, I think of the United Kingdom, where Reform is at this moment is polling as the first party. Of course, in Italy, we have Giorgia Meloni, who looks like a moderate now, but she comes from a very clear history of, as a personal history, as the person is the history of a person who always was a militant of the extreme right. Now, how do you see a Europe where Marine Le Pen is at the Elysee, and I don't know, Farage is at 10 Downing Street? Would that change things dramatically? Would that be an existential threat to liberal democracies?
Well, Europe is not immune from democracy's problems all over the world. All democracies are struggling with a whole series of issues. I think it's important in Europe to take a little bit broader perspective. The rise of far-right parties, at least those that have a clearly anti-democratic character, of course it's dangerous, but there's a deeper issue for Europe. My colleague Richard Young's a terrific British analyst, has just written a nice piece about this in Foreign Policy magazine, arguing that we have to be careful not to think that the core problem in Europe is the rise of the far right. The core problem is that European democracies have not been as responsive to their citizens, as effective in delivering what citizens want over the last 20 years as they should have been. And so citizens are frustrated on many fronts about life in Europe, and that's what makes them embrace leaders who question the whole system and want to overthrow it in various ways or overturn it. And so we have to get more to the challenge of how can European democracies be more effective, be more responsive. And until they are, you're going to continue to have citizens look elsewhere. So that's the core problem for Europe.
But what do we really mean when we say, it's not been effective? Because if we look at it from objectively, I mean, this is still one of the wealthiest parts of the world, is a place where people are free. There's a freedom of association,
Sure.
free
Yeah.
press. There's everywhere in Europe we have a free welfare health system. I mean, everyone can have access to the health system for paying nothing. We have a pension system that still is bearing the weight of its aging population. So where are we really missing the point? I'm talking as a politician as well. Where's the problem?
European voters keep voting for other parties despite everything that you described. Why is that? Well, first, there are two big issues, I think. One is on the economic front. The European middle classes for the last 20 years have not been doing very well. They've been kind of stagnating. Job growth has been relatively weak. Wage growth has been weak. And many people today in Europe feel like their life is no better than it was 20 years ago, maybe worse, and that their children's life is likely to be worse. So very weak economic growth. Europe has had, of every region in the world, probably the lowest average economic growth in the world over the last 20 years. So that's huge. So yes, it's still pretty good compared to a lot of places, but that's not how a person in northern France who's, lost his job and is struggling to figure out what he's going to do. He's 46 years old, doesn't think, well, I'm still better than that person in Bangladesh. He thinks, my father had a steady job and things were getting better. What happened to this country? So one is economic, and then the other is sociocultural. This was the biggest wave of sociocultural change in Europe in the last couple of generations, the wave of immigration. Turned European countries from being, not countries of immigration into countries of immigration. That's big, big change to look around at your neighbors and say, I don't understand the language that person is speaking on the bus. They look different from me. They don't go to my church. They go somewhere else to worship if they do at all. And, I think a lot of people underestimated how much that change threatened people. And we've been, startled again and again by the power of the immigration issue in European politics. Time to stop being startled and to think about, effective responses to it. So this combination of economic weakness and social change seem to be at the roots of why many European voters are looking for other choices.
But, without migrants, we would not survive because we don't make any children anymore. I mean, in Italy, we have one of the lowest ratio.
That's true.
And
there are lots of good arguments for why migrants are helpful
but
to
the question is,
countries.
how can we build a narrative to explain? I mean, why don't we? Because, of course, in 30 years' time, in Italy, there will be more people receiving a pension from the state rather than people paying for social contribution. And at this moment, we're struggling with finding teachers, physicians in hospitals, nurses, bus drivers, because really we're losing a lot of children.
Yeah.
And so clearly, in order to receive a pension myself, I will need some people working and paying social contributions, and there are less and less Italians around. So either we manage this migration flow or our societies are going to collapse economically. And so the question is, we are complaining against migration and we are scared sometimes, concerned or scared around the migration flow, but we are in a position where without them we're going to be even less able to produce wealth and prosperity. So it's a catch-22.
It is. You've made a good description of the positive side of it, but you need to take that argument out into the certain suburbs of Paris and certain suburbs of Rome and make that case to people who see their lives changed in ways that they didn't feel they were really asked. It just kind of started happening. And people weren't making that case 20 years ago. They weren't saying that to them. They didn't really feel that they were really consulted on this pretty dramatic social change. You have Swedish cities where more than 25% of people are foreign born. In a country with Sweden's kind of traditional homogeneity, that's startling to people. So the case you make now is good, but you needed to start making that about 20 years ago, very effectively and very forcefully and very creatively, and I don't think that was done.
But I always remember of this beautiful African, I think, proverb that says that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is now, because there's no alternative. Now, another question I'd like to ask you about Europe, because I was also impressed by the Polish case. Because we had the time of the Morawiecki and the Kaczynski, and then Donald Tusk won the election, and everyone thought that Poland was back. But then a president was elected that was again of the Kaczynski and Morawiecki's party, and now Poland is not back anymore, and it is stuck. And also, other question on Poland, they started with courts. As you described in the tool set in the toolbox of the autocrats, and what your thoughts around tribunals around the world and courts? Are they the line defending liberal democracies? We've seen the dynamics between Trump and the Supreme Court and the courts in general. The Supreme Court in Brazil standing up to Bolsonaro. So these are the two questions: Poland and from Poland to tribunals and courts in general.
Well, when leaders try to amass power and push away any limitations on them. Courts, inevitably are one of their first targets because courts are the most serious limitation on political power. If you say to a politician, there are rules you have to follow no matter what, that's very challenging to a politician who wants all the power. And so you're right. These illiberal leaders go after the courts, often first thing. It was one of the early big reforms in Hungary, was undercutting the judiciary. Israel, Netanyahu, the constant battle over the courts. Mexico, the judicial reform program that AMLO carried out. The cases that you mentioned, Donald Trump has been bad-mouthing the courts in all kinds of ways. So it's kind of natural. But courts aren't the only. So we have to be careful. If we only relied on courts, we'd be in trouble because in many places, leaders have been pretty effective at undercutting them. In India, for example, Narendra Modi has been pretty successful at taming the Indian courts, even though we traditionally thought of India as a country with a pretty strong rule of law. But he's been pretty good at finding ways to undercut them. And so India relies on other things to try to preserve Indian democracy. I mean, of course, it hasn't given up on the courts, but the courts aren't the only game in town when it comes to limiting power. There's also legislatures, there's independent agencies, there's civic actors, there's opposition parties, there's the media, and so forth. So yes, court central, that's why they're such an early target, but no, they're not the only game in town. Poland is, a very important example. The 2023 election was a big turning point, but, Poland's very divided between both two conceptions of what Poland should be as a country and two political groups that represent those. And when one managed in 2023 to squeak out a victory, or won a good victory, but when it managed to beat the other side didn't just go away. The other side was still there and was fighting back. And so Poland is caught between, two powerful sides really contending with each other. And we shouldn't be surprised, but those who thought 2023 was the light broke through and now it's going to be a sunny day with no wind and no rain in Poland, were kidding themselves. And so there's still plenty of Polish voters who liked what they had before and want to see it back. And I think it's been hard for the Tusk government to deliver on some of the things that they promised in terms of expansion of rights in some areas. They've struggled to sort of get the media back in a better state. The judicial reforms have been, complicated. It's not easy taking apart these illiberal measures that are put in.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned polarization because you've written extensively about that as one of the key threats to democracy. But polarization seems to feed on itself because the more democracy is attacked, the more divided societies become. Now, is there a way out of that spiral?
What we have to hope is if polarization has produced a government which is destructive of democracy, one side has come in and said, we have to get rid of these checks on our power because our vision is, just too important. You have to hope that effort fails. Polarization sometimes happens when, the party that's really driving the country towards illiberalism runs into a wall. Unfortunately, it doesn't. In many countries, it just drives through that wall, like in Belarus when they just 2020 smashed through the election constraints. In Georgia, after the recent elections there, the Georgia Dream is just continuing to amass power. But you have to hope that you can find ways to constrain that, and polarization will, in a way, kind of defuse. But on the other hand, if you have a case that's not yet that far down the road and is very polarized, which we see in a number of places like the United States, then you have to look for ways to bridge these divides among people. You have to look for institutions that potentially are bridges. You have to look for people. You have to look for narratives. You have to look for ways of relating at the community level, the regional level, the national level. Overcoming a country which has become two communities or camps that distrust each other so fundamentally is really, really difficult. The United States is really in a struggle over this, so I don't think it's impossible, and I think American democracy may eventually come back to a somewhat more consensual version of the country, but it's going to be it's not going to be easy.
It's going to be important, I think, also for the mechanics of democracy, because it seems to me that the Congress is often like stuck because they don't manage to get to the right majorities. sometimes they need 60 senators to approve bills, and that just doesn't happen. There's no cooperation, build, no consensus building.
Yeah, the Congress is a reflection, is both a reflection of the polarization we have, and it contributes to it in ways. There are certain ways Congress functions that are, part of it is in how we choose our candidates for Congress. The primary process tends to encourage candidates who are sort of products of the hardcore base of each party rather than centrist type candidates. So the primary process in the United States favors that. The two-party system, which is kind of built into our system, because of first past or the winner, winner take all in the districts, and no proportional representation means that you're sort of stuck with the two-party system. Whereas if we had a proportional representation system, the parties would probably break into 3 or 4 or 5 parties, and we'd have coalitions and the ability to have more creative politicking. So there are structures in the Congress and in our electoral system that are feeding the polarization. At the same time, these institutions are gripped by the polarization. So it's a bad cycle.
And I will tell you that from a country that has a history of proportional systems, it also has its downsides.
In terms
of so there's no such thing as a perfect place, probably. But thank you very much, Tom. The last question I ask all my guests is to give us homework. I'd like our viewers and listeners to try to be personally engaged in the defense of liberal democracies. So if there's something you would advise us to do, even a small gesture that can make a difference, but from the personal level.
I would ask your listeners to try to challenge your own way of thinking by reading from sources other than the ones you're most comfortable with and most familiar with. Try reading a publication outside your comfort zone, even just 5 minutes a day. Even if you're like, oh, this upsets my lunch, I don't like reading this. Well, read the best of them and think, there's a different point of view. You're not saying that you have to accept that it's correct or legitimate. Just test the waters. Try yourself out. I really try to push myself to read a very politically diverse range of sources, and I learn things from that. Sometimes it gets, my heart racing a little bit or my blood pressure up. But you've got to push yourself to see the other side through its own eyes and not to impose upon it your views. It's hard to do. It's painful and frustrating. And then, of course, if you can do that in conversations, that's good, although that can be difficult. It's easier to do in the privacy of your own thinking and reading and consultation. So start there and see if that takes you somewhere in terms of coming to terms with all of these forces that are hitting our democracy so hard. But thanks for having me. I enjoyed the conversation and hope it's been useful and even maybe a little entertaining to your listeners.
So the advice is get out of your bubble. But thank you very much, Tom, and thanks to all the viewers and the listeners. Of course, let us know what you thought of this episode, this conversation with Thomas Carothers in the comments below, and we will be here in 2 weeks' time with another guest. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Tom. And I hope to see you somewhere around the globe. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure. Look forward to it.